This is part 2 commentary on the book Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell. In part 1, we talked a little bit about how the whites from the least developed areas of the British Isles brought a culture to the American South of violence, pride, and boastfulness, of which the blacks in the South picked up and kept as a dominant part in the ghetto culture, right? And in part 2, we're going to go over the economic and intellectual influences of the cracker culture adopted by the black culture, right? So let's go ahead and open up this book here and see if we can get some understanding.
Observers of the white population of the antebellum South often commented not only on their poverty, but also on their lack of industriousness or entrepreneurship. A contemporary characterized many white Southerners as too poor to keep slaves and too proud to work. Their labors tended to be intermittent, often when they were pressed for money, rather than a steady employment career. Frederick Law Olmsted called it lazy poverty, with whatever work that they did being done in a thoughtless manner. Summarizing his observations in the antebellum South, Olmsted said, "I know that while men seldom want an abundance of coarse food in the cotton states, the proportion of the free white men who live as well in any aspect of our working classes in the North, on an average, is small, and that the citizens of the cotton states as a whole are poor. They work little, and that little badly. They earn little, they sell little, they buy little, and they have little, very little, of the common comforts and consolations of civilized life. Their destitution is not material only. It is intellectual and it is moral."
Here we go. So Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the landscape architect who helped design Central Park in New York, commented saying that the antebellum Southern white men were lazy and that they were working in a manner that seemed to be thoughtless, right? And so he was comparing them to the Northerners who had a completely different mentality and a different approach to work, right? And so from Olmsted's perspective, it appeared that these white Southerners wanted very little out of life, right? And not only did he deem them to be lacking in material matters, he thought them also to be lacking in intellectual and the moral department as well. And so many other Northern observers had similar types of sentiments about the people in the Old South also. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell goes on to discuss how Olmsted and other observers noted that much of the time when they did run across a well-run business, library, or any other efficiently functioning institution at any time in the antebellum South, that they found them to be managed by Northerners, foreigners, or by Jews, right? So think about the correlation here with the main theme of the book to understand what's being implied here, right? So let's continue going and see what else we can get.
Comments on the lack of enterprise by Southern whites were made by numerous observers in various parts of the South. In Alexis de Tocqueville's classic Democracy in America, he contrasted the attitudes toward work among Southern and Northern whites as being so great as to be visible to the casual observer sailing down the Ohio River and comparing the Ohio side with the Kentucky side. These were not just the prejudices of outsiders. No Southern man, South Carolina's famed Senator John C. Calhoun said, "Not even the poorest or the lowest will, under any circumstances, perform menial labor. He has too much pride for that." General Robert E. Lee likewise declared, "Our people are opposed to work. Our troops, officers, community, and press all ridicule and resist it." Many whites, according to a leading Southern historian, were disposed to leave good enough alone and put off changes till the morrow.
So it was not just outsiders making these claims about the Southern whites being lazy, right? It was people that were from the South, like the Senator John C. Calhoun, right? And also General Robert E. Lee, right? And you could tell that they were very frustrated by the remarks that they made and how they were having a hard time getting the Southern whites to do even menial work, right? The Southern whites believed that they were above that type of work, right? And General Robert Lee, he said that they resisted, right? And so this was a prevalent mindset in the early Southern culture, according to many of the observers. And most of the enslaved Negroes were surrounded by this type of attitude, right? So think about that.
Very similar kinds of comments were made about these Southerners' ancestors in the parts of the British Isles from which they came. Although the term lazy appears frequently in comments on these people on both sides of the Atlantic, there has been no evidence of any such aversion on their part to strenuous physical activity in dancing, fighting, hunting, and any other recreational activities. So sloth was not the real issue. Nor have rednecks or crackers been prominent in such less physically demanding activities as entrepreneurship or scholarship. It is the nature of the particular activities in which they have taken an active interest and on which they have expended their energies, rather than the physical demands of those activities, that seems to have been crucial.
So this is important because the reality is that nobody's actually lazy in the general sense, right? People are just lazy in the things that they don't want to do or the things that they don't find interest in doing. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying that these Southern whites had ancestors from the British Isles, which were called lazy by other people, but in actuality, they were not lazy when it came to things like dancing, fighting, and other recreational activities, right, which were of interest to them. But rather, the entrepreneurship and scholarship were not their primary interests. So in the eyes of others, they seen them as being lazy, right? And so it is with groups here in America where they expend a lot of energy in dance, music, sports, entertainment, and religion, right? And they are most definitely not lazy in those departments, right? Not to any degree. Why is that? Because those are areas which they highly value. But areas like math, science, technology, those are areas that are not culturally valued. So the participation in those areas is relatively low, right? And that's as expected, right? You can't expect anything else from that.
Not only did many of the groups who settled in the South disdain business as a career, as their ancestors had in the parts of Britain from which they came, they typically lacked the kinds of habits necessary to be successful in business. Among the habits needed to run a business, none is more basic than a steady application to the task at hand, doing things in a business-like way. Even when there was a business to transact, Southerners would often stop to go watch a cockfight or a parade, or visit a saloon or go hunting. In traveling in the South, a Northern visitor commented in the 1850s, "You become astonished at the little attention men pay to their business." Such views were not confined to Northerners, however, nor to urban businesses. According to a noted history of the antebellum South, the Richmond Enquirer attributed the success of Northern farmers where Southerners had failed to the social nature of the latter, which led them to gather around the courthouse and county stores to smoke, chew, talk politics, and in general to waste time. Many Southern businessmen were unreliable about either paying their bills or delivering goods and services when promised.
Gathering around the store to smoke, chew tobacco, talk politics, and just letting the time go by without any care in the world, these were the customs brewing in the Old South, right? Can we still see this today? You let me know, right? But understand that this is the activity that is valuable to the people that do them, right? And it doesn't make them less of a human, and neither does it make anyone more important because they don't do it, right? Understand that. But as a result, if people spend their time doing these activities, right, standing on the corner, chewing tobacco and shooting the breeze, then they should not complain about any injustice and unequal outcomes in life, right? People have to understand that they're responsible for the choices that they make, right? A person who hangs out on the block shooting the breeze for hours on the day should not expect the same results as someone who spends that same amount of time perfecting a skill that's valuable to society. Right? Two completely different inputs get two completely different outcomes, right? These are the basics that we're talking about. And so these are some of the attitudes and practices which shape the economic culture of the South.
Given the historical background of crackers and rednecks in Britain, it could hardly be expected that intellectual activity would be a major interest of theirs in the United States. A study of 18,000 county records from 17th century colonial Virginia showed that nearly half of all the white male Virginians were so illiterate that they could not sign their names and simply made a mark on legal documents. While the small Virginia aristocracy were often well educated and had impressive collections of books in their homes, these books were typically imported from England rather than purchased from local bookstores. Thomas Jefferson complained that the area where he lived was without a single bookstore. As late as the census of 1850, more than 1/5 of Southern whites were still illiterate, compared to less than 1% of New Englanders.
Now look at this. The old Southern whites were so illiterate that they couldn't write their own name, right? But the small Virginia elite were well educated, right? With impressive book collections in their homes, right? There was a massive cultural difference between these two groups of people. Whereas one group's culture, the Virginia elite, they optimized their culture for controlling societies, right? Which is one of the reasons why they had an impressive book collection, right, in their homes, right? They needed to use the power of intellect, right, as a leverage to permit such a small group of elites to rule the masses. And the other group's culture, the working class antebellum Southern whites, was optimized for activities like fighting, hunting, dancing, singing, and other recreational activities, right? And so neither culture was better than the other in the general sense. But each of them did have better cultures for achieving very specific outcomes, right? And there's no doubt about that.
When it came to inventions, only 8% of the patents issued in 1851 went to residents of the southern states, whose white population was approximately 1/3 of the white population of the country. Even in agriculture, the main economic activity of the region, only 9 out of 62 patents for agricultural implements went to Southerners. The cotton gin, perhaps the most crucial invention for the antebellum South, was invented by a Northerner.
Now, can you believe that only 8% of the total patents issued in 1851 went to the South, right? And even in fields like agriculture, which was the South's major economic dependence, only 9 out of 62 of those patents went to Southerners, right? Northerners were responsible for the majority of the inventions, to the degree where even the cotton gin was an invention of a Northerner. Who? Eli Whitney, right? We're talking about a difference in mindset and a difference in culture, right? And these differences had nothing to do with the skin color of the people.
A Southerner said to Frederick Law Olmsted, "The fact is, sir, the people here are not like you Northern people. They don't reason out everything so." Olmsted himself likewise concluded from his travels in the antebellum South that Southerners were greatly disinclined to exact and careful reasoning.
Now, understand that the reasoning faculty is like a muscle, and it needs to be exercised continuously in order to develop, right? And the antebellum Southerners, according to Frederick Law Olmsted, were greatly disinclined to careful reasoning, right? They didn't desire to develop that faculty up to a certain degree, or I should say at least to the degree which many Northerners thought to be adequate. And so one of the things that I realize is that the developing of the reasoning faculty is one that humans in general naturally do their best to avoid, right? Especially at an early age. It's almost like its development is contrary to nature, which is why it's important to have a culture which encourages its use and development in challenging subjects.
As late as the First World War, white soldiers from Georgia, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Mississippi scored lower on mental tests than black soldiers from Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania. At higher levels of achievement, the contrast between the South and other regions was even more stark. A study of leading American figures in the arts and sciences in the first half of the 19th century found most clustered in the Northeast, while vast regions of the South, Virginia alone excepted, were without a single one. The kinds of statistical disparities found between Southern whites and Northern whites in the past are today often taken as evidence or proof of racial discrimination, when such disparities are found between the black and white populations of the country as a whole, while others have taken such disparities as signs of genetic deficiencies. Yet clearly neither racial discrimination nor racial inferiority can explain similar differences between whites in the North and the South in earlier centuries. This should at least raise questions about such explanations when applied to blacks at a later era who inherited the culture of white Southerners.
The cultural aspects inherited or influenced by the redneck culture on those who identify as black cannot be ignored when discussing their condition in America, right? If groups have cultures which incentivize ignorance and self-destructive behavior, then that must be taken into consideration, right? People can't just blame other people for 100% of their circumstances and then take no responsibility at all, right? If a group's success depends entirely on what another group thinks or how another group acts towards them, then that's what is known as a slave, right? And it's an unfortunate mentality to have in today's time. But the good news is that if individuals or if groups have that type of worldview, then they could change it if they desire to, right? Because there's never been a better time in history to do so than today, right? And so this is the end of part 2 commentary on the book Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell. So make sure to stay tuned for part 3, where we're going to be discussing sexuality and religious practices coming from the redneck cracker culture and its influence on black culture, right? And so I want to thank you for watching the video until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 3.